Well, good morning, good afternoon, and hopefully not for too many of you, good evening. Thank you for joining this session where we will be discussing the difference between funding and financing. My name is Henry Patel, and I'm a vice president with Kiewit Development Company based in Dallas, Texas. Kiewit Development is the alternative procurement arm of Kiewit, one of the largest privately owned construction companies. If we can go to the next slide, I will let my fellow panelists introduce themselves in the order on screen. Dennis?
Good morning, good afternoon. Dennis Bram from Winstead. We're a law firm working nationally in the P3 area and working on various water projects.
Hi, everyone. My name is Ed Crooks. I'm with HNTB. Most of you know us in the transportation world as one of the largest engineering and advisory firms in the U.S. Before HNTB, I had some experience in the water sector with a water development company in Central and Eastern Europe doing P3 water development there, and spent some time on the EPA's Environmental Finance Advisory Board looking at financing issues related to environmental projects.
And hi, everyone. I'm Stephen Norton-Smith from Ernst & Young Infrastructure Advisors. We're financial and commercial advisors to government and private sector clients in alternative delivery projects. I lead our work in energy and environmental infrastructure more generally.
Yeah, you might be on mute. Sorry. Well, if it's okay, we'll move forward to the next slide. Yeah, if possible, we'll let you introduce yourself on the slide where you'll be talking on the topic.
Sounds good.
Oh, great.
Can you?
So, go ahead.
Good afternoon, and apologies, there had to be technological issues. My name is Yay Massar. I'm a senior director with Hyatt Brown. Hyatt Brown is a diversely staffed engineering, construction management, and advisory firm. On the advisory side, we provide P3 real estate and infrastructure advisory services to primarily public sector and institutions of higher ed. I bring about 20 years of experience in infrastructure and capital projects, and really excited to be part of this panel today.
Thank you. Well, before we start, a shameless plug. I've had the privilege to chair AI's water subcommittee for the past 4 years. Our primary focus over that time has been to develop a water sector specific toolkit to really help water districts and agencies as they consider the use of the P3 model for their projects. While it's not intended to be the end all be all for P3, it is intended to provide a number of high-level considerations and thoughts. So if possible, to the attendees, please do stop by AI's virtual booth for more information. And the web address there is on the top to learn a little bit more about the toolkit. One of the topics that is included in the toolkit is funding and financing. So you'll probably see a lot of the repeat of the conversation here today as part of the toolkit. So with that, on to the subject at hand. One of my favorite ways of starting the conversation with respect to funding and financing is using homes and mortgages. That's something that we all are well accustomed to and have experience in personally. The mortgage that a bank really provides to home buyers is expected to be repaid by each of us, being the borrowers. Typically, as homeowners, our primary funding stream to repay that mortgage is our employment income, but it could also include investment income, savings, gifts, inheritance. And so in that personal example, if you will, the mortgage itself is the financing by which we purchase the home up front, and that financing, that mortgage, is really repaid over the long term by our own income streams. And that is equated, if you will, to the funding stream. Now, to make it a bit more relevant to the conversation here today and to the conference, we'll let Yaya Maher provide some examples of funding streams, specifically in the water sector.
Thank you, Henry. Essentially, the simple definition, really, funding we see as being public money that is available to develop and build a project and not intended to be repaid or carry a cost. Essentially, who ultimately pays for the project in the long term. And traditionally, water infrastructure has been funded through a few different sources. And I think, number one, taxes, tax revenue, whether from a general fund, project specific, or usage specific. For instance, the Fargo-Moorhead Flood Diversion Project, which is very interesting in terms of a variety of funding sources that are used, will be partially funded through voter-approved sales taxes, about $1 billion of the total $2.75 billion. There are also city flood control taxes and infrastructure taxes as sources of funding, and possibly some special assessments to be levied. Another source that, as you will see on the slide, grants or funding programs, and particularly the EPA Drinking Water State Revolving Fund and the EPA Clean Water State Revolving Fund. This is essentially a federal government and state partnership whereby federally appropriated funds are allotted to each state's drinking water state revolving fund based on their needs survey. So the EPA provides grants to all 50 states and Puerto Rico to capitalize each state's drinking water, clean water, SRF loan programs, and then the state in turn, after providing a match, provides low interest loans or grants to state and local drinking water infrastructure project. Similarly, for the clean water SRF, which provides financial assistance for a variety of water quality protection projects, such as for wastewater, watershed and estuary management. You also have creation of green infrastructure projects. And using the same mechanism, the states then provides this financial support, this financial assistance. One grant program, as another example, is the EPA Clean Water Construction Grant Program, the CWC grant, and they do receive funding from the EPA, and this grant can provide up to 55% of project's total cost, to the extent that the remainder is funded through non-federal sources. I'm going to touch upon two other funding streams: the USDA Rural Development Water and Environmental Program, as well as HUD Community Development Block Grants, which respectively provides supports for rural communities, as well as water infrastructure investment support in low-income communities. We do have direct federal appropriations, and we see that a lot, Henry and my colleagues in the water resource sector, where specific funding is allotted to specific projects through entities such as the Army Corps. And while these grant and funding programs have been very successful, really the primary drinking and clean water infrastructure funding mechanism are user fees. The water, sewer, stormwater rates and charges that you and I and the broader populace provide. And while this remains the primary funding stream, I think it just brings us to, despite this variety of funding sources, it's been clear that unfortunately in the US, and not unlike other countries, we've consistently underinvested in the renewal and replacement of our systems. And today, with the aging systems and the demands of growing urbanization and the need to have climate resilient systems, we are facing a significant funding gap. I think the EPA estimates about $540 billion funding gap between the projected current available funding and projected needs. And really, I think this conversation that we've been having this week, where we ought to not just look at, but really test a broader set of tools to stretch these federal, state, and local dollars, and leverage federal financing that I think Stephen is going to touch upon a little bit, as well as, importantly, private sector financing and technical expertise. This will allow us not to sound like a broken clock, but really help accelerate these needs that we have to on the capital investments and drive innovation, and be able to do that in a way to protect the public interest through performance-based contracting. I'll stop there, Henry, and see if maybe Stephen will talk to us about financing next.
Sure. One of the challenges with funding, again, going back to my example on mortgages, is that 1 year's of salary or 1 year of income is likely, for many of us, not going to be able to entirely pay for the purchase of that house in 1 year. Therefore, we need to be able to stretch the dollars that we'll get over the future years. And where do we get that from? Is financing. So Stephen will walk us through some financing streams that are available, at least within the water sector as well. So on the next slide, please.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you very much. So financing is, to some degree, and mainly debt borrowed in order to construct infrastructure or modernize infrastructure, which then has to be repaid from the funding streams that we just heard about. In the water sector in the US, there are quite a range of financing options and models available to municipalities, cities, and utilities to advance their infrastructure goals. And those range from the federal through to the state and local partnership structures and private capital. So, very, very briefly, at the federal level, there are a number, but two of the key ones are USDA financing solution for small and rural communities for populations of 10,000 or less. But perhaps more widely followed is the EPA's WIFIA program, Water Infrastructure Finance Innovation Act program, which has been very successful in the last few years of pouring billions of dollars of new financing into water infrastructure projects across the country. At one level below that, as it was touched on, the SRFs, the Drinking Water or Clean Water SRFs, while kind of co-funded between state and federal sources, provide long tenor, very low cost financing to sub-state entities, municipalities, municipal utilities, cities, etc. And those are a very common and prevalent way of financing medium-scale infrastructure. And then one level below that, which tend to be a municipal-driven financing solution, are revenue bonds, and slightly less often general obligation bonds in the water sector. And these are bonds which are issued by municipal enterprise, so the Drinking Water Enterprise Fund or the Wastewater Enterprise Fund, where the pledge for repayment is the water rates, wastewater rates that are levied by the municipality or the municipal utility. So those are all broadly tax exempt, very low cost, medium to long tenor loans, and then more often allied with alternative delivery models, whereas the former are more typically connected to more traditional contracting models, design, bid, build, etc. Then alternative delivery is more commonly aligned with private financing solutions, which might be a combination of equity, debt, either bank loan or private placement. Now, these sources of finance tend to be slightly higher in cost than the traditional tax-exempt models, but bring a range of characteristics and advantages that may not necessarily be seen with some of these other tax-exempt products. So in a broad sense, tax-exempt financing is typically long tenor, low coupon, and in the case of WIFIA, extremely flexible in terms of drawdown, repayment, and profiling. But what these project financing mechanics have in common is that there is no connection between the repayment of the debt or the repayment of the financing and the performance of the asset. And that's just one absolutely critical distinction between private finance-driven solutions and public finance-driven solutions. In all of the examples that I've given, equity and private sector debt excluded, any municipal borrower has to repay that loan regardless of whether the asset that money was earmarked for has performed, was delivered, is operating in accordance with its specification. So the public sector borrower bears the impairment risk, the risk that the amount borrowed is more than the amount that the asset is fundamentally worth. Whereas with private financing models, the equity and the debt model, the repayment of that debt and equity to the private sector is fundamentally connected to the performance of the asset, the ability to be available to produce water or wastewater to a required standard. And if that's not the case and the project fails, then the private sector borrowers bear the impairment risk. The public sector effectively scales back its financial obligation according to the value of the asset it ultimately got. Now, clearly, termination and failure are not desirable, but it is a fundamental protection offered in alternative delivery models, which kind of leads me to the final point, and then I'll stop monologuing, which is private financing and alternative delivery go very well together because they are fundamentally connected in the concept of delivering performance-based infrastructure solutions, where the incentive towards performance is driven by the risk and reward of debt and equity repayment as a result of the asset performance. And that just doesn't exist to the same degree in traditional delivery. Final point is that it is perfectly possible to combine multiple sources of financing together to create a cost of capital and balance of risk transfer profile which suits individual projects. So for very higher risk projects, then a private financing solution may be more appropriate. For low risk projects, a public financing solution may be more appropriate. For projects in the middle, you can blend public and private finance to give you the right mix of cost of capital and performance risk transfer. And I'll pause there.
Great, thanks, Stephen. As you rightly said, there's a number of different combinations of these financing tools that are available to owners and clients as they think about advancing these projects. Specifically with respect to P3, there's ways of combining that financing with different funding streams, and Ed really will provide some thoughts here on the revenue models that owners and agencies and districts can consider specifically if they're thinking about using P3s for water projects. So Ed, if you can walk us through some of that discussion and on the next slide, please.
Sure, happy to. And what a great setup from my fellow panelists here, because I'll be touching back to some points that both Yaya and Stephen have raised. So given this spectrum of funding sources and financing tools, how do those monies find their way into a P3 to support a private developer, operator in performance of rebuilding and operating a system? Well, I want to touch on three items that I think are relevant. User fees, the concept of availability payments, and then public sector contributions into a private, into a P3 approach. As Stephen just said, all kinds of opportunities for blending these streams. Let's start with the user fee portion first. Some P3s involve situations where a private developer is stepping into the position of billing and collecting retail fees for water and wastewater services. And there's some examples out there in the US, many more internationally. But let's take a moment to think about water fees in general. Those of you in the industry know that this is a very challenging topic, that the ability to change water rates is very heavily regulated and politically sensitive. All kinds of social justice issues come along with changing water rates. But just to give you a little perspective, I did some math, which is a dangerous thing. And I'd like to pose a question for folks to think about. I'll answer it in just a moment. How much do you think it costs to have 1 ton of water delivered to your home? 1 ton of water that's been treated to relatively high standards on a global basis and delivered to your home, available for you at your turning of the tap. Well, again, I did a little bit of research, and if my math is correct, ranges somewhere between $1 and $1.50 for a ton of water delivered to your home. And if you think about all that goes into producing that water, from the raw sources to the treatment to the delivery mechanisms, it's pretty evident that water is probably underpriced in our society, as it is most places around the world. So when you think about a P3 that involves potentially significant upfront new capital investment, user fees are going to help, but they're not going to cover the full cost of a private developer's obligations. Now, on the plus side, water rates are and utility revenues are generally quite stable and very financeable. They enjoy typically solid credit ratings, although there has been a trend of reduced water usage over the last couple of years that we're seeing some of those revenue numbers start to decline as a result. But the bottom line is that user fees can certainly support a P3, but to the extent there's significant capital investment involved, there needs to be something to supplement it. So let's talk about availability payments for a moment. Stephen talked about the need for projects to deliver on their performance obligations. Availability payments are a form of payment mechanism that's been widely used across the P3 industry. And essentially, it is a commitment by the public sponsor to make a series of scheduled payments to the private operator based on their performance and their ability to meet the performance standards that they've signed up to. Typically, availability payments are used to finance both the upfront capital investment and ongoing operating and maintenance costs, as well as the cost of financing. A lot of benefits to an availability payment structure. It's very, for the public sponsor, it's a very predictable way of managing their budgets. You know what your payments are going to be, at least you know the maximum that your payments are going to be over time. And there is the performance element that requires the operator, the private partner, to meet their commitments. For the private developer, availability payments are typically quite financeable. You're looking at usually a credit-worthy agency is committed to make those payments. Lenders will look at the private operator's ability to meet the performance requirements, but usually availability payment deals can be quite readily financed. The question is whether the availability payment amount required each year is sufficient to cover the operator's needs, and whether the public sponsor has enough revenue available to fund that. And that's where the third item comes in, which is public contributions. Whether the project involves user fees or availability payments or both, very often we see upfront contributions by the public sector, often in the form of milestone payments during construction, that help essentially buy down the financing cost for the private operator. Sources of this can be grant money, can be cash on hand, can be any number of other sources. But these upfront contributions can reduce the amount of the annual availability payments. It can allow the user fee stream, if that is part of the deal, to become a much more viable source of financing. And it, like I said earlier, it allows the public sponsors' availability payments to be brought down to a level that's manageable for the public sponsor. So, Henry, I think I'll stop there, and we'll look forward to hearing the rest of the panel.
Thanks, Ed. Certainly from the perspective of public contributions, again, going back to my very simple example with mortgages, it's very akin to putting down a larger down payment on your home to be able to reduce your monthly mortgage payment. You could, there's a lot of similarities to that concept with what you were just discussing in terms of public contributions. Now, one of the elements that Stephen did mention was cost of capital on the private financing side. It is, when you look at it on its own and without context of the larger benefits, one of the challenges people most often bring up is the cost of capital for private financing is too high. And as Stephen said, that needs to be balanced with the appropriate risk transfer. And so Dennis is going to take us through with some concluding thoughts on how to balance that cost of capital with some appropriate risk transfer. So Dennis, and on the please.
Thank you, Henry. Well, first of all, I think that the panelists have done a great job of outlining all the different kind of pros and cons and aspects of what's out there. What I really wanted to focus on, kind of keying off of Stephen's comment about the private side of this, was the private funding of these projects. And my perspective comes from representing higher ed institutions that are looking to avoid encumbering through some type of public finance structure their revenue streams, and instead they're looking for new innovative ways to finance these kinds of capital projects on their campuses. And there's no doubt that there are hybrid models for this, where in order to do a project, for example, on a higher ed campus, the school or college has to come forward and provide some type of infrastructure in order to bring it to the site, if you will, of the particular project. But what we're starting to see in a more practical way is a lot of companies out there who are vying to do P3 projects on a more less traditional and maybe more creative process. Not to say that traditional project finance is not creative, but what kinds of things are they looking at? And there are really sort of two models on that side of the spectrum. As Stephen pointed out, there's the debt side, there's the private debt side, there's the private equity side. In today's market, we're very fortunate to have such low interest rates that the old traditional view of, well, let's go get some public financing because it's cheaper, is not necessarily true anymore. And there are private lenders out there, institutional private lenders, who are being very competitive with rates, depending on what their collateral is for the project, which obviously in this water context usually means, water purchase agreements, take and pay agreements from creditworthy sources who are obligated over a long term to pay that rate and therefore repay the loan that the private developer on the P3 side has taken out. But I'm also seeing that there is so much private equity in the US marketplace today that's, as we all know, investing in a variety of businesses across all sectors. And the P3 infrastructure sector, water sector, is sort of no stranger to that now either. So you're seeing companies bring significant equity to the table to finance these projects. And some of them do not even need private financing. And not only do they not need private financing, but they're shying away from private financing. So to avoid the type of structure that Stephen was speaking about, where you may have a construction loan and then some type of private placement following the construction loan for a longer term permanent financing, where you've got multiple lenders involved, you've got prior commitments that have to be made, you've got lender controls on the project, from the public sector perspective, you've got a possible risk of a lender stepping in to a default situation by notwithstanding the secured revenue stream. If the borrower P3 private developer entity goes belly up, you've got, if you take the lender out of the equation, you're mitigating the risk with respect to that lender and the public institution. And then the public institution looks to the private side, the equity side, to finance it, knowing that they're going to deliver to the private side the same strong, resilient, and dependable revenue stream that the equity developer P3 side needs in order to justify that equity investment. Most of these equity groups have in turn investors who are looking at their equity investment, looking for a secure return on that investment, almost like a coupon return. A little different than the home mortgage situation, but they're looking for a coupon return from the group they invested in, who in turn have brought the project to fruition and brought the that revenue stream to the table for them. And in that kind of scenario, in terms of mitigation of risk, the public side, in my case, the higher institutional side, is looking for certainty of quality of water, sustainability of water, environmental resiliency with respect to the water and the project, particularly if it's been a reuse of a brownfield site into a new green site, which is also very attractive to the higher ed type of water client. It's looking for alternative ways to provide that water so they don't have to get it from the municipality. They can negotiate the rates in a different way than they would have negotiated those rates with a municipality. They can get credits for reclamation, particularly if it's a project that involves not just water production, but reclamation and reusage of water. So there are kind of a variety of very interesting creative models starting to appear on the water scene that are very attractive to higher ed, as well as private industry, I might add. And so the risk then is put on the developer from a design, build, operation perspective to bring all the right dynamics and elements to the table to ensure the long-term sustainability of the project. That developer is taking the risk on the construction side, so there are no construction cost overrun risks on the public side. They're taking the risk on operations. They're taking the OPEX, CAPEX risk with respect to the long-term viability of the project. And you haven't had to have one lender step in to exercise control at any milestone of the project. And you've got the public sector watching those milestones and testing the private developer to ensure that they perform and deliver. So I sort of suggest to you and to the group listening that while it's really, it's critical that we still have the traditional methods that Yaye and Stephen and Ed talked about, and those are going to be around for a long time, particularly in the context of massive numbers of trillions of dollars being sanctioned by the federal government for new infrastructure projects. And there will be ways to tap into all those public finance sources. The private sector is really something that's growing, particularly in a low interest rate environment. And as a result of that, the public sector can take advantage of significant risk transfer of the project to the private sector. Let me stop there.
Thank you, Dennis. As you rightly said, given the amount of press with respect to infrastructure that we're all seeing now, we do want to leave the audience here with some overarching themes. So on the next slide, please. As I said, 3 overarching themes. First, there's, as was mentioned earlier, there's an ongoing reduction on water usage, which has been placing further pressure to increase water rates and user fees. Second, Long-term borrowing rates are at their historic lows, while construction escalation continues to increase and to creep. And third, there is wider recognition for the need to optimize not just upfront construction costs, but as has been stated a couple of times, whole life costs, which includes ongoing operations and maintenance. So the objective isn't to reduce the upfront construction costs, but to balance and minimize the totality of all costs, upfront as well as ongoing operations and maintenance. And so, as Dennis said, P3s are not right for all projects, and not all projects are actually well suited to be delivered under a P3 model. However, under the right circumstances and with the appropriate financing in place and appropriate planning, P3s can be a valuable tool for owners and districts and clients to consider advancing their projects. With that, if there are any questions that the audience has, we're happy to go through them now. If also available to reach out to us or through AI. If you do have any follow-ups as you go through the rest of the conference as well. So we'll pause there to give folks a couple of minutes and also open it up to our other panelists to provide any concluding thoughts that they may have as well.
While we're waiting for a question, Henry, I would just say, and it's illustrated by this panel of experts around on the panel, and it's fundamental to P3 projects, which is that no matter who your client is, in the public sector, governmental, municipal, educational, or even on the private side of the P3 programs, it's critical to have this strategic thinking going on early. So I'll make a plug for making sure that all the consultants are hired early and before there's a RFP type process, that the engineers, including independent engineers, are included and sitting around the table, and the lawyers, not to forget the lawyers or the finance experts, because it really does take a team working with the municipality to create these kinds of projects and make sure you're not too far down the road before you've thought about some risk that you're looking to mitigate. So just a thought about that. Bring us all in early.
Henry, I had one other thought to add, if I may. And it kind of goes to some of the things Dennis was talking about. Yes, there is a cost differential between private and public capital. And I know very often when considering alternative delivery, the conversation kind of stops right there. But I think it's worth recognizing that for that higher cost of capital, you're getting something of value. And that is the rigor of a financially motivated and financially committed, competent party to deliver on the obligations and the performance goals that the public sponsor has laid out. Another nuance to that is it's not just, you get that from the equity side of a P3, but don't forget that lenders have a very strong interest in getting repaid. And so that brings an extra set of eyes to a transaction where a lender to a P3 deal is going to have their own independent engineers. They're going to do a lot of monitoring, and they're going to be very keenly interested to see that their borrower, the private party, is delivering on their obligations. So yes, there's more cost to private capital, but it comes with some benefits. Now, the challenge, of course, is to figure if those benefits outweigh the cost. Which gets you into a whole discussion of value for money. And I know that's not what we're going to talk about today, but just recognize that just because private capital costs more doesn't mean you stop there. You need to keep looking at it and see if it pays for itself.
Absolutely great point. And while there is recognition that you may have a lender, even if it's not a P3, as you rightly said, the role of that lender and the collateral that lender has differs dramatically, whether it is a project finance P3 based financing solution, or if it is more of the traditional general obligation type financing. So Stephen, I don't know if you have any concluding thoughts on your end kind of on that. I know there's a lot wrapped up into that comment, but that is fundamental to P3 financing.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think it's just really important for people to understand, options and consequences, and to pick the model that works best for a specific circumstance. And I think the danger in generalizing is that it just loses its significance in a particular project context. So the applying these general principles to very specific project circumstances and making an informed decision, regardless of whether that's P3 or something else.
Great, thank you, Stephen. And Yaima, you take us home. Some concluding thoughts on your end.
Sure. Thank you for those thoughts. I think really, bottom line, traditional approaches have worked, but we need to at least consider other ways of delivering the infrastructure and looking at it from a holistic, whole life perspective, not just on the financing, but what it takes to not just build it more efficiently, but maintain it and really have infrastructure for today and tomorrow's generations.
Excellent, thank you. And with that, again, we'd like to thank my panelists here for their time and availability to provide their thoughts. Also like to thank the audience for your attendance and in listening to some of our thoughts with respect to funding versus financing. As I started earlier, please do stop by the AI booth if you have a chance to the conference, not only to catch up to Lisa, Jonathan, Carol, and all the other friendly faces at AI, but to get some information regarding the toolkit, as I mentioned earlier, and as well as getting some information on the P3 Direct program within AI and all the other initiatives that AI is coordinating and leading on. Feel free to reach out to any of us panel members for any follow-up questions, either directly or through AI. And enjoy the rest of the conference and hope to see everybody in person real soon. Thank you all and have a good afternoon.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.